we've got Gary Cook. So Gary Cook is an advanced clinical pharmacist for the NHS at Forth Valley, and he's also a former SMC New Drug Committee member as well. Gary's hopefully going to be joining us shortly, and he'll be joining part of the panel as well. And we've also got Caroline Steeds, who's a Director of Value Communications here at Valid Insight, and she'll be adding some industry perspective to Gary's payer perspectives. So welcome, Caroline.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, some housekeeping rules for today. You'll have noticed that you're all muted, but that does not mean that there's no interaction that can take place. Please ask any questions that you have throughout the presentations or through the panel discussions that come to mind. We'll prioritize them and I'll ask them to the panel members at the end of the webinar. Just to highlight that all opinions that are discussed within this webinar today represent personal views. They're not any affiliation of anyone on the panel, but they really do represent their personal views. And with that, I'm going to hand across to Crispin, who's going to walk us through what are PROs and how can they be effectively utilised.
Thanks, Stephen. Good day, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. I thought I would just give a little bit of background information about what patient-reported outcome measures are to give some context for the discussion. Patient-reported outcome measures were sort of broadly first introduced as quality of life measures, they used to be called, or health status measures, probably in the 1970s. But they weren't really very widely accepted until the 1990s, really. And I think a number of people in the 70s and 80s thought, well, it's all very subjective, this, how can it be meaningful? Which is rather odd. It seems strange nowadays, in virtue of the fact that anybody would say, well, many of the reasons that people receive treatment is because they present for treatment and describe their symptoms. So a bit odd that people would present and describe their symptoms, but would not be allowed to systematically report. That's changed an enormous amount, and patient-reported outcome measures are used across a wide variety of potential applications, which we'll come to later on. Can you go back, Stephen? Stephen's in control of the question, the slides, so he's trying to read my mind, which is always a dangerous place to be. The US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, stipulate that any report of what is a patient-reported outcome measure is any report on the status of patient health that comes directly from the patient. So it's usually based assessment. Similarly, the European Medicine Agencies says it's any outcome based on a patient's perception of a disease and its treatment scored by the patient themselves. I think actually what they mean is assessed by the patient themselves. Patients don't actually score them. They're obviously scored by algorithms. So those are official definitions. And we can see from that with the FDA and the European Medicines Agency that this is no longer an idiosyncratic interest amongst some academics, but it's become very mainstream. Okay, to the next slide, thanks, great. So what do PROs, or patient-reported outcome measures as they're now called, typically measure? Well, that rather depends what they are, and they come in a variety of flavors, if you like. There are generic measures, and generic measures are ones that can be given to any patient group or indeed to the general population. Those of you who may have come across patient-reported outcome measures will probably know some of these. The SF36, the short form 36, is probably one of the best known, but there are others, the Nottingham Health Profile, the Sickness Impact Profile, although they're not so widely used anymore. There are also disease-specific measures, so ones for cardiovascular disease or for Parkinson's disease, as we'll talk about later on. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of disease-specific measures. There are also site-specific measures, which are the brothers of disease-specific, typically questionnaires that are designed to measure the impact of a condition on a particular site. By that, I mean something like a hip or a knee score. Questionnaires can also produce a profile and or an index. A profile, as we'll see in a moment, can be a number of different areas of measurement, such as mobility, social functioning, activities of daily life, emotional well-being. And an index is a summary overall score. Some questionnaires only provide an index, and some only provide a set of profile scores. Index measures are the ones that potentially can lend themselves to utility measurement, of which I can think of a number. So the Health Utility Index and the EQ5D are index measures, and they are utility measures, and they can be used in the measurement and assessment of quality adjusted life years, which are used in the United Kingdom, certainly, by NDICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Effectiveness, to influence their, or to guide their decisions for what treatments that they'll pay for. ISPOR, the International Society for Patient Outcome Research, has a taxonomy of what they unfortunately call clinical outcomes, which I think is just begging for confusion. So they say that there are a number of clinical outcome assessments, of which one is a clinically reported outcome. What? Anyhow, a clinically reported outcome is an outcome which is an assessment by a clinician of the well-being and health of a patient. However, clinical outcome assessments in this taxonomy also include patient-reported outcomes, which are the questionnaires we're discussing today, but also observer-reported outcomes, and these are assessments made by non-physicians and not patients. So this will be carers or children or parents. And then there are performance outcomes, which are assessments of how one performs in a particular task, like how far does one walk in the 6-minute walk test, how many words can someone remember from a memory test. What do pros typically measure, though? It's going to be overall health status, perception of one's own health, activities of daily living, potentially impact of symptoms on daily activities, although that would perhaps more likely be a symptom scale, and severity of symptoms. Sometimes also satisfaction with treatment and adherence to medical treatment is also included as potential areas measured by pros, but really those would fall more in patient experiences, and patient experiences are another set of measures that are brothers to pros, but PREMs, as they're called, basically are assessments about what people think about their treatment, not how their treatment has affected them, but whether they think the doctors have been giving them appropriate information and treating them with respect and dignity and so on. Okay, next slide, please. So quality of life, increasingly important and increasingly central to the measurement of interventions. Why would that be the case? And I think it's an increasing awareness that the patient is central and their view is central to all healthcare. That rather traditional view that patients were treated by the doctor and then that was it would now seem strangely out of date. So it's a way of providing information that can only be got from the patient. So it makes a lot of sense when you consider that many interventions don't actually necessarily extend life, but the treatment is to try and improve quality of life. There are a number of long-term terminal conditions where the treatments are not to actually make that to prevent death, but to increase quality of life. Obviously, a lot of aspects of quality of life are known only to patients, so in terms of emotional health and pain. Pros can, it has been suggested, enable decision-making on choice of treatments for multiple stakeholders, although some people would say that using pros in that way is possibly pushing them to beyond the limit for which they were initially designed, certainly if you're talking about at the level of the individual, because many pros are not designed for that at the level of the individual. Also, the idea that doctors can assess patients accurately is somewhat less popular view. There is a considerable level of evidence that clinical assessments of health and well-being are not well associated with how patients themselves assess their well-being. So asking the patient is obviously central to measuring outcomes in a meaningful way. So what would a good quality validated pro do? Possible uses for them? What could we use them for? A number of these are contentious, but what has been suggested is targeting of resources to needs in the population. So population-based surveys to try and find groups that would be best served with increasing medical or health care. For individual patient care, that is a contentious one because, as I say, many patient-reported outcome measures were not designed for use at the level of the individual. But they can be used as a guide to the clinical interview, and a questionnaire that I worked on, the Parkinson's disease questionnaire, which we'll talk about in a sec, was used by a major healthcare organization, HMO, in the States, not to create scores for their individual patients, but just to talk to patients about their quality of life, and using the 39 questions in the questionnaire to guide the clinical interview. Similarly, they can be used for clinical assessment and screening, again contentious, but some questionnaires in the United Kingdom have been used for that purpose to guide whether people will be deemed eligible for certain interventions. A less contentious area is that they are used in randomized controlled trials to evaluate outcomes, and are increasingly now used as a primary endpoint, but often have been used as a secondary point, which can be useful for label claims and such. They can also be used for routine evaluations of services. That happens in the United Kingdom, where the hips, knees, varicose veins, and hernia operations are routinely assessed by the initiatives that are assessed to see how well people are doing. And the technology can all be linked together. So a way of assessing, I've worked in a number of conditions, diabetes and a number of others, where a electronic monitor or some such, or a mobile phone giving information is used to try and help patients with their daily treatment. And that can be evaluated at the group level from responses that patients give to quality of life measures that can be incorporated within that platform. And there's an example here, the asthma bliss suite. Okay, next. So patient reported outcomes need to be both valid and reliable measurements of the intended concept. As the FDA stresses, it is extremely important when defining a therapeutic benefit to include measurements about how they feel and function, but these must be accurate and built to a standard which is of meaning that the data that is created is meaningful. So all instruments are evaluated for both content validity and construct validity. Content validity is, do they contain content that is meaningful for patients? They should do, in virtue of the fact that a high quality PROM should be based on patient reports, so interviews with patients. But once you have developed the PROM from those interviews, then it is a very wise idea to show it to another group of patients and have a cognitive debriefing interview. And that's a situation where you say to patients, can we run through this questionnaire with you? And you tell us whether it appears to make sense and is covering issues that are important. Also, they're assessed for construct validity, i.e. you would not expect a questionnaire to be completely at odds with clinical judgment. As we've said, clinical judgment is often not a reliable indicator of how people report their own well-being, but one would be a bit alarmed if clinicians' assessment of health state was completely at odds with a patient-reported outcome measure. And also in terms of just severity of disease and length of time, you would expect that to be reflected in the scores gained from a questionnaire. Instruments must be reliable and measuring the intended concept. And that can be evaluated to some extent by what's called internal consistency, to the extent to which items within a questionnaire are tapping an underlying concept, and also retest reliability. Does the measure give the same answer at the same score at different times in the groups of patients when nothing has happened to them, when there's been no intervention? We would assume that the questionnaire score would remain stable over time. So I thought I'd give you an example of the use of a quality of life measure in an area I work in. I work in a number of neurological conditions. And one area I've worked in is Parkinson's disease. And this is some results from a study called PD-Med, which is a medication study for Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease, as you probably are all aware, is quite common. There are over 4 million people in the world with Parkinson's disease, and that's believed to be quite an underestimate. So, and there's been an increase in an argument that levodopa-sparing therapies might mean that the most common treatment, which is levodopa, would become more efficacious over time. Its efficacy wouldn't decline over time if people are given these levodopa-sparing therapies. So levodopa is the standard treatment for Parkinson's disease, and levodopa wears off as time goes by. So an argument is that patients could be given dopamine agonists, and that's a compound that activates dopamine receptors, or monoamine oxidase B's inhibitors, that's something like selegiline. And the argument is that these levodopa-sparing therapies will be given early on and possibly ongoing with levodopa. And this would mean that over time, levodopa remains more efficacious and doesn't have the wearing off effect. So we ran a trial, and the primary outcome measure was the Parkinson's disease questionnaire. That was a measure that was developed in Oxford some years ago. It measures 8 dimensions, which some of them are put up here, not all of them: mobility, emotional well-being, social support, bodily discomfort. It also measures activities of daily living, stigma, communications, and cognitions. But in this trial, the interest was in measuring self-reported mobility, and an overall index score can be calculated. There was an interest in seeing whether their overall score in terms of the impact of Parkinson's disease on quality of life, how that changed as well. So here we have the results which go to 8 years out in our trial, and we see that we've aggregated the dopamine agonists with the MAOB, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So they're it's levodopa alone versus levodopa and levodopa-sparing therapy. And as you can see, levodopa-sparing therapy actually has very little to recommend it would appear. The results here suggest that people who were on levodopa-sparing actually did slightly worse than those who were on just levodopa alone. And that benefit of just being on levodopa alone was maintained to, as I say, 8 years out. And the difference is 1.8 points, not enormous, and possibly not terribly meaningful to any individual, but certainly suggesting levodopa sparing, which some of the drugs when we started this trial were very expensive, would not seem to be a useful use of resources. And this is for mobility. We have a look at the overall score here. Sorry, it says results from PDQ-39 mobility at the top of the slide. That's not right. It's results from the single index. And we again see that there is benefit to just having levodopa alone rather than also with a levodopa sparing drugs as well. So the question is, if one's going to use a pro, what does one do? Does one select one, or does one create one? Selecting one is possibly a wise move in virtue of the fact that creating one can be an expensive activity. However, in order to select a pro, you need to have one that measures exactly what it is that you're hoping to measure in terms of what the impact is that you're hoping that your intervention will have. So in the FDA guidance, they make it very clear that if you have an intervention which you think will improve X, you must make sure that you're measuring that X. And that can mean that many pre-existing pros may not be appropriate. That said, for Parkinson's disease, for example, the PDQ-39 is very widely used, as most of the drugs that are developed are targeted at the areas which it measures, and it's widely accepted as an appropriate measure because of that reason. If you're going to select one, there are a number of issues. You need to check the content and construct validity, the tests of reliability, make sure that there is it's sensitive to changes. And that also, especially if you're running an international trial, that it's valid in different languages. If you decide that there isn't an appropriate outcome measure, then that activity of developing one is potentially a way forward. That can be a long process. And can be, as you can see, a potentially quite expensive one, and has a number of aspects to it. One has to begin with interviews with stakeholders, that'll be physicians, researchers, do some public and patient involvement research, also talk perhaps to purchasers and providers and people who may use the questionnaire and what they want from it. Once you've got an idea about what sort of questionnaire you want to be developing, you need to then get the content from it and that and that will have to come from interviews with patients. That data is then analysed, and a draft questionnaire is then created. That will then need to be shown to patients in a cognitive debriefing to make sure they understand it and it seems appropriate. Possibly also shown to clinicians to make sure that it covers all of the areas they think is relevant. I don't think that clinicians at this stage should be taking anything out. They might say that it would be appropriate to add something in, and that might be something one would want to go back to patients with to say, do you think that this idea is worth incorporating? And then a number of surveys undertaking the measure to develop its psychometric, to assess its psychometric criteria, and also to determine its sensitivity to change. And that's very important to have an idea of what the minimally important difference is for a questionnaire, such that you know if you've actually detected a meaningful difference and a difference that is meaningful to patients. So that gives us a broad general introduction to the area of patient-reported outcomes, and I hope it was useful.
Perfect, and thank you very much, Crispin. And just to expand, given the costs that we've just talked about there on ensuring that PROs are effectively used, Laura's now going to take us through where PROs fit into the typical market access strategy.
Thank you, Stephen and Crispin. Yes, so today I sort of wanted to touch on where PROs might typically fit into your market access strategy. And what I mean by market access strategy is sort of what is needed for both clinical and commercial success for your product, and crucially, where can we demonstrate a patient benefit while also ensuring a return on investment for your manufacturer. So I think PRO data can fit quite nicely into sort of the general wider strategy within your market access strategy, from helping to define your patient population and identifying any unmet needs that you're trying to address, to building a sort of strong patient-centric evidence-based supporting that product, and then incorporating that evidence into your key value deliverables. Of course, if there is room to translate PRO data into economic benefits, even better, and that's very attractive to stakeholders, also leaving you in a sort of stronger position to secure optimal pricing. And of course, there's the involvement in of the patient perspective in any communication strategy is also quite vital. So I think there's a lot of potential for inclusion for PRO data within that overall wider strategy. But I think what needs to be thought about carefully within that is essentially preparation times and costs. So finding first and foremost your rationale, what you're really trying to measure, and crucially, are those in line with what your stakeholders are likely to want? Sometimes that is quite transparent through guidance, and there will be sort of key instruments that are preferred, but it's not always transparent. So some due diligence might be needed upfront there, and consideration again to whether it might be a primary or secondary endpoint that you're including your PRO in can also have implications down the road. So is there an existing PRO instrument in place? There may well be a gold standard. Depending on the therapeutic area, there may be clinical guidelines which may advocate for that gold standard. So it would be wise to sort of carefully consider including that instrument. Any HTA bodies may also dictate whether they have sort of preferences for particular instruments. So including those would definitely be something that you might be considering. There's also more and more emphasis on core outcome sets. I know recently with certainly within the UK, NICE case for change consultation on evaluation methods, core outcome sets came up as one area for further exploration in the future. So there may be a gold standard in place, but we still need to assess and do due diligence to see whether that gold standard or any other instrument that you might be considering would be appropriate for use within that target population itself, and really assess those measurement properties. Is it likely to give you robust data? Is it likely to show change following your treatment? And within that, are there any modifications that may need to come along down the track? That's in itself not a simple process. There would be, agreements from developers needed, and sort of quite careful following of agreed guidelines for modifications there. So things like that would need to be considered, and of course, it all costs money in your budget, whether there's modifications or no modifications. Many instruments will be licensed and have a cost associated with that. Of course, if there's no suitable instrument, costs associated with the development of a new instrument can certainly be costly. So all this would need to be thought about in time to get that data for those key discussions with stakeholders. So payers do agree that PRO evidence can have an impact on the decision-making process. But where is that PRO data likely to have sort of high value in that decision-making process? Well, one area may be, as we've discussed earlier, treatment effects, where traditional clinical endpoints might not pick up key things that your treatment's trying to change. In an increasingly competitive environment, high-cost drugs, your PRO data may be that added value to add to that sort of evidence base to support. Where specific PROs are in clinical guidelines and HTA requirements, there may be some sort of it may be dictated which instrument that can be used, and these are likely to be quite familiar with your key stakeholders. May also allow for comparisons between treatments if other products are also being assessed with the same measures. As touched on previously, whether an instrument is used as a primary endpoint or not may have an impact on decision making. Certainly some evidence has been shown in respiratory and neurological conditions where it may hold more weight in the decision making process if they're a primary endpoint. All of this is sort of foundational on whether the PRO instrument itself is of good quality and robust design. Essentially, that is going to show up in the quality of your data. And lastly, sort of the condition area, I guess, or the therapeutic area. There will be some therapeutic areas where PROs are very widely established, such as oncology, and right down to your clinician and clinical practice, they will be familiar with the PROs in question. Next slide, please. So demonstrating patient benefit through PRO evidence is great, but translating that into economic benefits is obviously desirable when approaching payers. And a selection of PROs that have utility weights attached can be used to demonstrate economic benefit. And what we're probably most familiar with is the Euroqual EQ5D, which is certainly supported within NICE and various other HTA bodies, which is a health related quality of life instrument with utility weights attached to it based on societal valuations. One caveat here may be that you would need to sort of do some due diligence whether health related quality of life is likely to be a key differentiator, and whether that instrument is going to be sensitive to the condition groups that you're actually treating. Thank you. So demonstrating value, how can PRO data help with that sort of patient-centric value and differentiation in a product? So I think using it to really understand your population of interest, even internally aligning to within a company to see where that unmet need is, where can we sort of target this product. Obviously, you've gathered all this this sort of patient-centric evidence, but can they be translated into economic benefits? And crucially, is there potential to compare to competitors? I think it can also, it demonstrates value beyond the patient itself. So if you think about potential reduction in care burden, or demonstrating increased quality of life for a carer, that is also something else that you can add to your value deliverables, but probably something that's not quite so utilized. Thank you. Next slide. And then finally, using PRO data to communicate the value of a product for patients is crucial. And I think this sort of key thing here for this slide is publications, really, making the best use of that data, and how can you communicate that data to all these various stakeholders that you want to communicate value to. And that includes making, lay summaries for patients and carers, but also the academic routes and through peer-reviewed articles, etc., and patient networks. So I think there's a good toolkit there for PRO data to be involved in that whole wider market access strategy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you, Crispin. Great presentations. What I want to do now is to move on to that expert discussion. I'm very pleased to welcome Gary. Gary has joined us, which is fantastic, and thank you very much for joining us, Gary. I think my first question would be to you. I mean, we've talked, well, Crispin and Laura have talked to PROs there. And many of those sort of attributes that have been discussed, do they ring true to you as a payer in your experience?
Hi there. Hi, can you hear me fine?
We can, Gary, yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the presentations highlighted quite well the potential of PROs. I think and also highlighted the challenges, and the challenges around how reliable, how robust, scientifically some of these measures are. The great from a payer and a society and health service perspective for PROs is the inability mostly to link utilities to these. You know, when you think about the sorts of things we link utility to, and you look at PROs in general, there really should be a better alignment of utility and PRO outcomes. You know, if you're a patient, you want to take a medicine that's going to make your day-to-day life better, mostly. You know, outside, you know, blunt drug therapies to cure life-ending diseases such as cancer, mostly you want to take a medication that makes your day-to-day life better. And it's a shame that we have some PROs and some measurements that do record that, but we've just been unable to capture them in a proper economic evaluation.
Absolutely. In terms of that, Caroline, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on the back of that. I mean, it's a great point from Gary about linking that utility to the PRO outcomes. Caroline, Crispin, maybe, I don't know if there's anything in response there.
Yeah, just obviously when you're looking at PROs and what you're measuring, it as we've said, it's got to be what's most important to the patient. And when developing these instruments, we have to make sure that they're measuring what we think they're measuring. And it's that, as I think Crispin alluded to, in the validity and validating the instruments is making sure as well that the patient reported outcomes can be linked to the clinical outcomes. So you do see cases where you see a change in the clinical outcome measures, but not seeing it within the patient reported outcomes, and then obviously that becomes difficult. So it's making sure that the instruments are sensitive enough that they're able to track it and change over time, which is important as well. Many of these conditions are long term, and it's important that whatever instrument that you're able to track change, and it will be able to pick up change over time as well. But yeah, no, I agree on the utilities as well. I think it's very important that you can link the two.
I think that's an interesting point about utility measurement. It's worth, Laura raised an interesting issue relating to the Euroqol, of course, that it's not relevant to all patient groups, or may not appear to be, at least at surface face value. But it's interesting to note that there are ways that you can use data from disease-specific measures, and you can utility weight the results from disease-specific measures. It's a rather tortured activity, but that the argument then is that those questionnaires will be measuring what's important to patients, but could also be giving a utility weight.
Absolutely, and I think to me one of the key questions is, I mean, we've discussed PROs, we've talked through them there. In your opinion, Gary, you know, in your experience as a payer, how much influence do they actually have on meaningful decision making?
So far, I would say relatively disappointingly little. And much of that is around the utility measure, because unfortunately a lot of these decisions are, the whole process has to be robust and objective. Therefore, what you have to consider has to be very measurable and objective. So when you're doing a health economic analysis of a drug, bringing in measures that don't have that level of robustness around how objective it is very, very difficult. You know, so I'll give you some examples. In rheumatology, you know, we had drugs that we had some evidence made a big difference to patients' day-to-day lives and how they felt. We all knew that around the table. We all looked at that evidence and thought that was a good thing, and this was powerful as clinicians. However, it was very difficult for us to then bring that into the economic analysis and use that to alter the decision-making process, because ultimately it was very difficult to keep that robust and objective and scientific.
Absolutely. And
but it has been done. I'll give you an example. Relatively recently, a drug called Selexipag for pulmonary arterial hypertension. If you look at the SMC deliberation on that, the clinical evidence argument was not very robust, but the patient argument from having to go into hospital regularly for infusions and the huge impact in that life of that patient versus taking a oral medicine at home was enough to swing that decision. And that was articulated in the final deliberation for that drug. So it can happen.
Yeah. And I think this relates. We've had a question come in from Brian, and thank you, Brian, which looks at those clinically meaningful change thresholds, and the opinion that the panel has on that. And I think that's a sort of good relation to that, Gary. Again, Carolyn, Crispin, any response there, and any further response on sort of those clinically meaningful changes regarding PROs?
Yeah, no, it's interesting that Brian, I don't know Brian, but he makes the interesting point about that the German authorities have stated that somewhere in the region of a 15% change is a meaningful change. And actually, of course, that's debatable, in fact. 15% could be a huge amount of change. So we calculated minimally important differences for our PDQ-39. And I would say that a change of 5% on some of the dimensions is meaningful and substantial for patients. A 15% change would probably be almost impossible to do, to have a drug that had such an amazing effect. So there are a number of issues. I also take the point about, I've never thought of it like this, but that NICE is so obsessed by the EQ5D. Might this stifle attempts to try and get preference-based measures from other questionnaires? Quite possibly so. Certainly NICE only seem to want to have data from the EQ5D. But of course, a lot of the mapping has been derived from the EQ5D. So I don't know if a case could be made to NICE that we didn't use the EQ5D, but the way we've worked out our utility is based on EQ5D. We have calibrated our questionnaire for its utility measurement from the EQ5D, which is what they sort of do at Sheffield. So an interesting point.
And I think, sorry, Caroline, feel free.
I was just going to add to that in the discussion around EQ5D and in different areas. I know I worked a lot in ophthalmology. One thing the EQ5D wasn't effective in picking up changes when you're looking at sight. It's sensitive to things like that. So what we looked at years ago, and I think the comment's been made as well, is actually looking at a disease-specific instrument and trying to map it to utilities as well. So it depends very much on, I guess, the disease area and going back to the question around how much it can influence the decision making, and it really depends on the extent of that as to what the endpoint in the disease area. So clearly things like where it's something like pain or depression, which has to be driving the primary endpoints, then obviously that has a big influence. But in some other disease areas, the PRO is seen maybe more supporting to the efficacy and safety data, and in that case it's maybe not having as much influence, but it does seem to be very obviously variable across the different disease areas.
Absolutely, and certainly context, I assume that's going to have less and more influence, as just been alluded to. I mean, I guess we've all touched on, or you've all touched on NICE and the changes that have happened there again slightly. I mean, do you think at all, Gary, that this influence will change as we move forward into the future?
I think so. I mean, I noticed NICE had their consultation back in December there about changing the way the assessment and technology appraisals, and there's a lot in that document around moving towards being warmer to patient-related outcomes and other measures. So I do think it's changing. I think it has to change. I mean, regarding Germany having this 15% threshold and things like that, I can't help but think there's an element of scientific and mathematical snobbery around how we're judging evidence from PROs versus other evidence. you know, it seems like we're almost putting a bigger threshold, a higher hoop to jump, because of this evidence is potentially thought of as less. That worries me slightly, because at the end of the day, who are we serving here? We're serving patients, and PROs are absolutely vital.
Excellent, and I certainly agree, Carolyn.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, you know, and I think Crispin put it well at the beginning. Patients go to the doctor because they have a problem, or they go for treatment because they have a problem, and that's where it starts, and that the patients have to be the focus, and how they feel. And we know that if patients are given a treatment and they don't see a benefit, they stop taking treatment. So it's really important that we're able to understand what it gives to the patient in terms of how meaningful it is. And we hear peers talk a lot now about like patient relevant outcomes as well, in that making sure that what you're looking at and what you're measuring, or if your product has a particular benefit on an aspect, it's something that's really important to the patient and impacts their everyday life, and that's really important. But I agree, it's gaining more focus, and I think that's definitely a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think I mean that one more thing I want to just consider, and a bit before I see we've got a lot of questions come in throughout the talk, which is excellent, and I'll address a few of these to the panel very shortly. But we've talked a lot about PRO data at the launch of a product. What about PROs as a use for post-launch, once a decision's been made on coverage, for example? Is there a use for PRO data there? And Gary, I'll send that to you again first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Maybe not necessarily extending coverage, but possibly. But I think certainly with regards to increasing market share or utilization of a given product, I think if we have good post-marketing data of patient benefit, patient satisfaction with the product, and you know, Laura touched on adherence for me there really is with regards to if a patient takes a drug that they're not feeling any benefit day to day, then adherence just falls out the window. And you know, we've got multiple international studies showing us that adherence is appalling across many sectors, and that's not only wasted money from a payer perspective, but it's wasted health gain for patients. So I think post-marketing data showing benefit of the drug could take a drug from being a second or a third line choice in a formulary and in a nation to push it up to near a first line. So absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Great. I do want to address, as I said, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, so I want to address some of the comments that have come in before. A question from Lalith, which says, what about treating PROMs just like lab results? Do you see the integration happening in clinical practice? And if not, what are the barriers? I don't know if any of the panel want to discuss there. Maybe if I start with Crispin, maybe?
Not entirely sure I understand the question. Is it the case that they're saying that you get your patient-reported outcome result for a given patient, and this would influence the treatment regime that you would be considering? If that's what is being said, I think that there's a potential risk there, because the questionnaires were not designed with individual, in many instances, were not designed with individual treatment in mind. So they're designed for use at the group level and possibly don't have the required accuracy at the level of the individual to indicate what would be the next course of action.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of answer the question. I think I've understood it.
No, I think that does, Crispin. I think that does, and I think probably you're the best person certainly to answer that. But I think another question from Elizabeth as well, which is key one in terms of the FDA, who are requiring more qualitative evidence of meaningful change to contextualize MCTs. Do any of the panel have comments on that? Any comments about the FDA and their requirements?
Sure. Some quick thoughts, Stephen. Thanks for your question, Elizabeth. So it's sort of taking it back a little bit to, I don't really think we can apply these sort of blanket scores or thresholds in changes of scores, and can sort of depend to some extent on a particular instrument and what you're looking for within those scores. And I think a good point is to sort of bring it back to the patient, as was mentioned in the comments, from a sort of more qualitative perspective. So I know there's some interesting work going on with the likes of exit interviews, where it may be embedded within a trial, where there's known changes in your sort of before and after groups, and we can sort of get those qualitative meanings to support the evidence in terms of what that actually change is, and whether it's meaningful to patients and what it means to their everyday life. So I think that's definitely sort of further areas to explore. I know it's been currently explored in various areas.
Great. In the absence of further questions, I mean, I've got one which for me is really crucial, and just thinking through of what's been discussed there and the payer influence, etc. I mean, a question, I'll address it first to Gary and then to Carolyn, but given the fact that there is a sort of slight disconnect between the influence of PROs on decision making, etc., and we think in the future that will increase, how do we create that shift? How do we create that shift to where PROs become a really important tool in payer decision making?
That's a difficult one. You know, I see a lot of the bodies, NICE, SMC, and it's happening increasingly in Europe as well, as bringing in patient representative groups into the decision-making processes and health technology appraisals. And at the moment, I can't help but think a lot of that, just to an extent, is lip service at the moment. And it's how do we take that to the next level where we can actually quantify, measure, and put a value on some of that. And again, it brings me back to utilities. And I think until we get studies and evidence that can place that type of currency on this type of information and qualitative data, then we're going to really struggle. It's going to take a shift in mindset and the evaluation of that data. And I'm not really sure how we're going to achieve that, but I think it will come.
Okay, that's good. And Carolyn, I don't know if there's any thoughts you have there as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it will come. I think it's moving in the right direction, and you know, more and more you hear about how people talk more about patient access and things about being more patient centric, and that's obviously important. So I think that it will improve. Again, it depends a lot on the condition. You do obviously some disease areas, the patient voice is very high. In areas like cancer, there's a lot more pressure from some of the patient associations and group, and that has created a lot of noise, and probably why quality of life, particularly in patient-reported outcomes in cancer trials, is very established now, whereas in other areas maybe less so. It's harder in things like maybe rare diseases where you're looking at small patient groups to work with, and it's new diseases, new treatments that are coming to the market. So it's a difficult question in terms of how can we change it. I think it is a process, and I think it's moving, and we alluded earlier to NICE looking at this as well, and some of the other HTA bodies moving that focus again to look more at PROs and patient outcomes, and how it can all be integrated into that decision making process.
Absolutely. Great. Well, on that, we're getting close to the hour, and we've already taken questions from the audience. If there's anything additional that anyone wants answering, we're happy to come back to you following this, so please drop them into the chat. But what I wanted to just quickly do was to ask for a quick one-liner, if you will, from the panel about their key learning from today, or a key recommendation that you'd have for the industry. I'll start with Gary. If is there a key learning for you that the industry can apply?
Yeah, I think industry should collaborate more and make the investment in the research to try and link these patient-related outcomes to outcomes that will be meaningful with regard to peers and governments, and make that link towards a utility that we can measure and place a value on it for economic evaluation.
Great, absolutely. Carolyn.
So I think it's key in terms of considering the patient and talking to patients as early on in the process and developing the product, to make sure you really understand what's important for patients, and then what needs to be and what's key to measure. Looking at, is there an established instrument already available that fits what you need, or is it something you're going to have to create? Because as Crispin and Laura mentioned, it takes time and costs to develop these instruments. So it's really important to know if you're going to need something, that you do that early enough in the process, and not to maybe just use a off the shelf, so to speak, instrument that's available just because it is there. If it doesn't measure what you want it, and it's not going to pick up change over the course of your studies, then you'll get to the end and have data that you can't do, doesn't support the value messages that you want to get across. So really important to just think about that all very early on, and really involve and talk to patients rather than even just clinicians who often speak on behalf of patients. But if you get it from the patient direct, you'll get a more accurate picture.